Something's different.
Something's missing.
Is it perhaps the long-awaited resolution to our trauma theory? Bonjour, my fine diners, and welcome back to Film Tidbits, where we serve up scrumptious theories and choice morsels of film analysis for your tasting pleasure. I am honored to be your head chef, and I am just thrilled to have you back for the final segment of our Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared feast. If you haven't yet watched parts 1 and 2, where I discuss the dark origin story behind the trauma theory and why it matters in interpreting the whole series, you can find the links in the description below. Please go ahead and check them out if you can. After all, it's those savory entrees that make dessert taste all the sweeter. Otherwise, let's pick up again right where we left off. Now, some of you may take issue with the timeline that I've presented, given how Red Guy is clearly an adult throughout the entire series. Where exactly, you may ask, is the evidence that this series takes place from the perspective of an adult Red Guy, retrospectively dreaming about a trauma that took place during his childhood? For one thing, Red Guy is distinguished from the other characters in his otherworldly meta-awareness of what's going on in the episodes. He frequently breaks the fourth wall, particularly in instances when something illogical or unexpected happens.
9:30. Fish everywhere. Fish everywhere.
Or, on the flip side, when he knows something important is about to happen.
If only there was a way to learn more about the world.
This is Red Guy's rational mind realizing that he's dreaming, that things in this happier TV world are not how they really happened, and reminding him of the tragic ending he cannot avoid. This retrospective timeline would also explain the adult details that are constantly leaking onto the children's television set, such as the stocks flying high newspaper headline or the obvious reference to cults in the Malcolm scene. These mature themes are blended into the otherwise childish world of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared because, in the end, they are the imperfect memories of years ago recalled and altered by Red Guy's now adult mind in the form of semi-realistic dreams. Finally, another huge breakthrough that the trauma theory makes with regards to timeline issues is in explaining the jumps between the real and imaginary worlds that seem to break the narrative continuity in episodes 5 and 6. Other theorists have had significant trouble with this, going to considerable lengths to stitch together some Frankensteinian monster of a timeline which really should have been left in its grave. MatPat places the entire series in the real world and thinks the transition from TV set to Office and Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared 6 is a flashback to the past, after which it goes into a metaphorical scene happening in the present and then skips to a future TV set in the real world. Inside a Mind claims that the first 5 episodes are dreams, from which Red Guy wakes up in episode 6 for a transition to the real world. And then while on stage, Red Guy decides to retreat into an imaginary world and I guess keeps thinking about his dream from before. And the series finally ends inside the imagination of another child in the next generation? Again, I think Matt, Pat, and Inside a Mind are incredible theorists and are obviously highly acclaimed content creators. But for me, the issue of the narrative and spatial timelines in Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is the single biggest hurdle to overcome, and these two resolutions just aren't it. My fine fellows, with the aid of the trauma theory, there is a far more satisfactory explanation here. Why the jumps between the fake and the real worlds? It is because in every dream, every memory, every thought regarding his past, Red Guy inevitably reaches the point in his trauma processing efforts that he cannot overcome: his survivor's guilt. This is the single central struggle of the entire series, and it will explain everything. But before we get to that, let us first discuss the evidence that survivor's guilt is even part of the picture to begin with. As I presented earlier when I laid out the trauma theory, Red Guy manages to escape from Roy, but he leaves the other two behind in the process. How do we know this? Because Yellow Guy and Duck never make it out of the dream world and into the real one. The only characters ever shown in the real world setting are Red Guy and Roy, while Duck's and Yellow Guy's deaths are explicitly exhibited within the dream world. If Red Guy is having nightmares about their deaths, it's not far-fetched to believe that Duck and Yellow Guy actually did die as children at the hands of Roy. And remember, Red Guy is consistently the most skeptical of Roy's teachings, frequently expressing his disagreement and trying to rebel.
I use my hair to express myself.
That sounds really boring. Wait a second.
What's your favourite colour?
Stop
Do you
talking.
like cows or goat's milk?
Be
Do you
quiet.
have brown hair? What is your blood type? Are you allergic
Shut
to
up!
oats?
So it would make sense that of the three, Red Guy was the least taken in by Roy's manipulation, and thus was the most willing to attempt an escape. Why did Red Guy leave Duck and Yellow Guy behind? Perhaps when he was by himself one day, he saw a rare opportunity and took it. Maybe Duck and Yellow Guy, fearful of Roy, refused to leave. Who knows? What we do know is that he tried to go back for them. This is represented by the phone calls in episode 5. The closing scene, with Red Guy walking away from a telephone booth, indicates that he was the one making the calls. And in the very same episode that he receives the calls, Duck finally snaps, shouting, "I don't want to do this anymore," and running off set.
Should wait before we put it on the plate, or it could be too late.
It is my belief that after escaping, Red Guy made attempts to communicate with his two friends, encouraging them to leave as well. He persuaded Duck to run away, but Duck was fatally unsuccessful in his escape attempt, after which he was recaptured by Roy and killed for his disobedience. Roy used Duck's murder as an example to Yellow Guy, stuffing him with the knowledge of what would happen to him if he, too, disobeyed. I personally believe that Roy forced Yellow Guy to eat his friend to really underscore the lesson. Besides, we don't know how the interspecies dynamics of the "don't hug me, I'm scared" world works. Maybe it's not even weird for Yellow Guys to eat ducks, I don't know. But Yellow Guy misses his friends, and when he begins to act out in defiance as a result, Roy puts a swift end to him. And I wouldn't put it past Roy to literally drown the boy in oil. But that's not the main point. So Red Guy feels immense guilt for having survived this ordeal while his friends did not, especially because he chose to leave them behind in order to save himself. But his guilt doesn't stop at his failure to save them. We see Red Guy's demons haunting him in episode 3 as well. After Yellow Guy runs off into the woods, Red Guy blithely shrugs and says, "I wonder what will happen," in the signature fourth wall rupture.
He seems upset about something. I wonder what will happen.
Although the kidnapping has yet to take place within his dream world, adult Red Guy understands that a great misfortune is forthcoming, that something bad will happen. When he asks Duck if they ought to follow Yellow Guy, Duck is more focused on their chicken picnic, and Red Guy readily agrees.
Maybe we should follow him, or we'll get left behind.
Yes, but there's lots of chicken left. I'd like to eat the chicken.
I'd also like to eat the chicken. Let's do that instead.
I'd also like to eat the chicken. Let's do that instead. As Red Guy revisits this memory, he really milks the scene, presenting himself as a negligent friend. Doesn't this sound exactly like someone beating themselves up for something they regret? As a result, Duck and Red Guy do not catch up to Yellow Guy until he is already in Roy's clutches, leading all three of them to be captured. Of course, Red Guy couldn't have foreseen this terrible turn of events when it actually happened. But perhaps he still blames himself for not immediately running after Yellow Guy. Regrets that all their misfortune could have been avoided and his friends saved if only he had not decided that day to first finish his picnic. Which leads me to... So, how does Red Guy's survivor's guilt play into the timeline issues we discussed earlier? Here we reach the breaking point. When his attempts to cope with his trauma fail as he hits the wall of his survivor's guilt, Red Guy has a mental breakdown where he begins to dissociate from reality. How do we know this? It's given straight to us in episode 4. We witness as the pace of this dream processing routine reaches a frenzied speed and his thoughts become distorted to grotesque levels. In the midst of this madness, Red Guy appears to exit from his dream, emerging into a space that is distinctly not the dream world he just came from, but is not quite fully in the real world either. The space has real-world proportions and has an actual duck substituting for his friend, but it's still a fake TV set with a fake googly-eyed camera. So what does this mean? Is he dreaming or awake? Well, take a look at what happens next. His head explodes. In other words, his mind breaks. Red Guy is not dreaming anymore, but neither is he totally awake in the sense of his normal level of functioning. He is having a mental breakdown, characterized by hallucinations, paranoia, and guilt. The breakdown starts in episode 4 and continues through episode 6. The low-budget version of the TV set of his dreams is symbolic of the inadequacy of Red Guy's coping mechanisms. What he was using as his routine to process his trauma was nothing more than a sham set with painted furniture and cheap props. When he finally opens his eyes and admits to himself that this is not enough to effectively deal with his mental health problems, Red Guy spirals, and his breakdown begins in earnest. He dissociates from reality and starts to exhibit erratic behavior as his mind leaps between imagination and real experience. This explains why Red Guy might have found himself in a real-world telephone booth at the end of episode 5, desperately trying to make calls to the friends that now survive only in his mind. It also explains how he makes a fool of himself in front of his boss and co-workers.
Hey, but wouldn't it be funny if one of these files came alive? Yeah, I am a file and you put documents in me and a a file. Funny silly file. You know, it did it like a song.
No. That sounds really boring.
Does that seem to you even remotely like the behavior of an upstart creative pitching a song idea to his boss, or a young adult clinging to the last vestiges of youth? No employee in a normal state of mind would do this in the middle of a workday right after his manager catches him napping in front of all his coworkers. It screams of his tortured state. His meek singing drips with desperation. His pleading search for someone, anyone else to affirm that his experience is normal and that he is okay is palpable here. Red Guy's mental breakdown comes to a head in the next scene when he gets up on stage, in the real world, mind you, stark naked, and starts reciting lines from his dreams. At this point, he hallucinates that Roy is in the audience watching him, and he again dissociates from reality. Within his broken mind now, he approaches a machine that serves as a metaphor for his survivor's guilt. Red Guy still believes he had the power to change the fate of his friends, had the whole dashboard in front of him, so to speak, had the tools within his grasp, but simply failed to use them. If he only pressed the right button, things would turn out differently, and he tries, all in vain, and still fails to take control. This is when the ever-lurking Roy makes his presence known. This is the final boss fight. This is the moment when Red Guy must face the demons lodged deepest in his soul. He sees Roy, with that arm capable of stretching infinitely, able to reach him no matter how far he tries to run. Then he looks back at the machine, and for the first time, we see acceptance. Red Guy is no longer trying to work the machine, trying to command fate. He finally accepts that it is not in his power. This is Roy's machine, not his. The guilt in this crime lies squarely on Roy's shoulders. And he can't control the machine. What's done is done. But there is one thing he can do. He can unplug that guilt from his mind. With a reprise of that foreboding, I wonder what will happen line, Red Guy finally comes to terms with his survivor's guilt and lets go. In doing so, he finds freedom. Of course, this isn't the end. A traumatic experience of this magnitude can't be erased so easily. No, this is the kind of tragedy that touches you forevermore. But still, for Red Guy, this marks a new beginning. His time in captivity will forever haunt him, but he can change the way his thoughts manifest, refocus on some of the precious happy moments of that unhappy time. The set simplifies as he no longer lingers on those terrible details. He imagines being with his friends, gifting them a new life with their favorite colors as they survive by his memory. And at last, that dreaded date that his mind has been stuck on for decades falls away. And time begins to move forward for him once again. As you savor those final bites, I want to hear from you, my dear guests. How did you enjoy the meal? What delighted your taste buds? What didn't taste quite right? I would genuinely love it if you would post a review in the comment section below. Be sure to smash that subscribe button if you want an invite to our next dinner, And please do share with your fellow film connoisseurs. It has certainly been my pleasure to share this meal with you all. This is your head chef signing off, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.